Welcome to the Fly Culture Podcast, bringing you interviews, reviews and fishing tips. Here's your host, Pete Tigus.
Welcome everyone back to the Fly Culture Podcast. I'm sent a lot of fishing videos. Some I watch, some are not for me, but there are people doing some interesting content out there. Tim Pottage is doing some cool things with mullet and lots of other species too. And my guest today, Sean Morrissey, sent me a beautiful film called Dreamstream about a trip he made to a remote river in Scotland. The thing that struck me most was, of course, the quality, but also the great editing and the narration he added. I liked it a lot, and so asked him along today. We have plenty to talk about, and I hope you're looking forward to it as much as me. Sean, it's great to have you along on the Fly Culture Podcast. How are you doing today?
Thanks, Pete. It's fantastic. I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm doing very, very well this morning.
Good. I'm pleased to hear that. And we're sort of well into the depths of off-fishing season at the moment. Is winter for you a time where you like to lay off fishing? Or do you go try travelling, see if you can find grayling somewhere or other? What is your plans over winter? What do you tend to do?
Yeah, the last few seasons I've definitely tried to fish for grayling as often as possible. It can be really enjoyable, kind of extending the season beyond the end of October. The rivers where I am tend to be a bit quieter during the winter, and there's always the chance that you might have one of those red letter days where you stumble on a shoal of grayling and you manage to catch every single one of them, and it feels like the river is alive in the dead of winter, which can be quite a thrill. This winter, we are 4 weeks into having a new arrival in my family. So my wife has just had a baby, and that has taken priority over my fishing. However, I did manage to get out to Loch Lomond for half a day about 2 weeks ago to fish for pike on the fly, and had the most fun I've had in a very, very long time. The pike were, I think it might have something to do with the warm autumn that we're having. Pike can be quite slow on the fly during the winter, especially in the colder months, but they were hungry and angry and happy to chase an 8-inch streamer, and the takes you get with pike are just they're absolutely to die for. I had one small jack come and explode at the fly, and in so doing it actually came sort of out the water about 3 feet or so. It gave me the fright of my life right at the end of the cast. So winter can be a quieter time, of course, but if you're willing to try a few different things, in my case I'm a trout angler, but if I'm willing to step outside my comfort zone and try a few things, then yeah, there can certainly be a lot of joy and a lot of fun to be had in the winter months.
And it's interesting what you said about the pike there, because I traditionally, again, primarily as a trout angler, think of pike as a winter species, although we are seeing these shifts now, aren't we, in angling, that people are targeting more species. And I mentioned Tim in the introduction, he's after just about everything but trout throughout the year. Do you think, have you noticed that sort of change where, you know, we've got mullet on the menu now, and obviously with the warm weather that we have over the summer and not being able to fish rivers, they're coming to play a little bit more. I was lucky enough to catch some wild carp as well, and things like that. Have you detected that sort of little bit of a change? And it almost sort of, you touched on it almost with the pike that you said at winter, but it implied to me that you possibly go follow them with the fly rod in summer too. Would that be right?
Yeah, I have to admit I've only fished for pike in the winter, but I have I think I've adapted my trout fishing over the last few years, which probably has seen me fishing more unusual tactics. I'm certainly not afraid to throw a size 4 streamer at a wild brown trout these days. And I think the techniques that you learn and the approaches that you learn to trout fishing, particularly when you're throwing streamers and bigger flies, they very naturally translate to other species like pike. And again, I haven't done much saltwater fishing, but I know that the sea trout fishing, the saltwater sea trout fishing in this part of the world, and also the pollock fishing can be really, really exciting. And then there's species as well that you can target throughout the year, but the fishing tends to also be quite good, between Christmas and February. And I think, the idea of having a passion and only really being able to chase that passion for half the year, I think is something that more and more of us are beginning to question and beginning to try and find, ways to extend the experience of fishing. I also think that, we'll probably get to talking about YouTube later in the conversation, Pete, but I think with social media and the way in which information is shared around the angling community around the world, there are probably possibilities that people in other parts of the world have been able to teach us about in the UK. I do think the UK fishing scene for quite a long time has probably been, quite traditional. I think the way in which we've approached our fishing, whether it's for, trout or sea trout or salmon or coarse species, has been, steeped in tradition and steeped in history. And thankfully, it seems that the barriers or the boundaries that we've put in place where, something is okay and something is not okay, these for the younger generations especially, these seem to be less and less important. And I think people are having more varied experiences and having a lot more fun and satisfaction as a result. So for me, that's definitely a good thing.
I think that's a great point, and I think we owe grayling a great debt for that as well. Whereas, I remember when people would tell me to whack grayling if I was trout fishing, which I never did and never will do. But they, to me, were one of the first things that people talked about, extending the season. And like you say, those moments where you could perhaps in October, and still can, of course, catch a grayling on a dry fly and then fish throughout the winter. And I think that started that move away, as you rightly say, from the traditional background to I love this so much, I want to do more of it. And that sort of has opened it, exactly as you say as well, about the other species and the impact that they have had via social media and other means, be it videos, be it whatever it may be, that has allowed people to say, actually, I could go do this. So, yeah, I'm going to tip my hat to grayling and say I think they helped that a great way and a great long way for us, and I'm really pleased to see that. Tell me something. Are you then? Because I'm still not there. I just so no interest in actually tying flies, and I tied after having Paul Gaskell on the podcast. I tied 3 nymphs with white beads, and they worked when I took them to the river. But I lost the will to live after that. Are you somebody who allocates some of that time when you're unable to fish for grayling or pike to some fly tying? I know you're going through a different stage at the moment where tying and fishing and everything else takes the back seat for a little bit. But are you one of those sort of people who say, right, I'm going to go and sit down and tie a dozen flies or half a dozen flies?
Yeah, I think since I started fly fishing, fly tying has been just part of the overall experience, and I can't think of anything more satisfying than, especially as a young angler, than catching a fish on a fly that you've tied yourself. So I've always tied flies. I haven't particularly enjoyed tying flies for the majority of my angling career, probably for the same reason as you, that it's, it can be quite tedious and quite laborious. And I think the last few years, probably the thing that sustained me is I've chosen a few patterns that I tie, and I tie those patterns in a range of sizes and colours, and I find the flow, the kind of experience of just doing something in a very repetitive way over and over again, much more pleasurable than tying like 1 or 2 of a pattern. And as a result, my fly boxes are now very ordered and very regimented and very predictable, and I only carry a very small number of patterns. But yeah, certainly they're probably tied in like 12s and 18s during the winter, and I only really tie flies during the season if I need to top up on a particular pattern. This year I've been, as I mentioned earlier, I've been using streamers quite a lot on my local river to fish for trout, and the streamers come with a very heavy 5.5mm tungsten bead, and as a consequence they end up getting hung up on rocks and tree branches. So I've worked my way through a good few of them and had to go back to the vise a few times to stock up on my size 4 shuggies. But I have also, because of the great experience I had fishing for pike the other week. I have gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole in terms of pike flies. And, one of the things about having a baby is you're awake, at funny times of the day when there isn't really much else to do. But we always have a phone next to us, or always have my laptop. So I've gone down a few YouTube rabbit holes looking at different styles of pike fly. And I'm ashamed to admit that I haven't yet caught a pike on a fly that I've tied myself. So I'm sitting with, a row of pike flies next to me as we're having this chat, actually, Pete. And I have been trying to get my head around bucktail and how to reverse tie bucktail and the different styles of pike fly construction. And it's great fun. See, doing something on a size 6/0 hook when you're used to tying on a size 14 or a 16, it's really, really good fun. And my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter, my older daughter, really loves them as well. I think if she could, she would wear them as earrings, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure that would be such a good idea.
That's a nice way to get them involved as well. And we have a fishing club in the village, and years back I went along and said, right, we were having a pike day. It was Any Method on a canal near Tiverton. And I just bought a bunch of materials and just let them choose. And I tied flies to see if we could catch fish on them, whatever they wanted. I sort of briefly explained how, a fly's put together, and then let them choose whatever the materials. And it made me think, when you were saying you had a bunch of pike flies there, given the background of, I suspect, like you say, you're trout fishing, you don't use many flies. Do you think you'll be a pike angler who goes to the locks or the canals or the rivers with a bunch of pike flies then, instead of trout flies?
Well, we'll see. Yeah, it's always funny. I've sometimes mixed my my flies for different species in the same box, and then if you're fishing with someone, they have a look in your box, and you're fishing for grayling, but you've got a size 4 trout streamer. Sometimes it raises some eyebrows. But I think with pike flies, yeah, I definitely, there's a style of pike fly that I really like, which has a flashy tail and then quite a big profile with the bucktail body, and some lead eyes, probably just to counteract the natural buoyancy of the bucktail. So I think I'll probably, over the next few weeks, I'll probably settle on one pike fly that I'll tie in different sizes and different styles as well, and that will just get added to the the assembly line when I do bust out the vise. I'll be tying my one pike fly along with my 3 trout nymphs and my 4 dry flies, or whatever it happens to be.
Nice. I like that a lot. One of the interesting things I loved about the video, which we'll come on to a little bit later, but a pattern that you talk about is the rusty spinner fly, and wondered if you could tell us a little bit about it, and for listeners, describe it, because I loved, and I'm sort of anti anything, but I loved where you said the rusty spinner even works in a caddis hatch. So I kind of liked that. But what do you think there is about it that is appealing to you as an angler? Because obviously you fish it a lot, so it gives you confidence, so that's why you fish it. But also, more importantly, why do the trout like it, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, this is where we get into the sort of the philosophy of trout and how they feed, and the long debate that we've had in fly fishing about generalist patterns versus very specific patterns. And I recall back in the day when it was sort of at the very beginning of the internet, but where there wasn't much content on YouTube, I recall getting a video from, was it a DVD or was it a video? It might have even been a videotape sent over from New Zealand back in the day when you had to order things through the mail. And it was anglers who were targeting huge brown trout in New Zealand and kind of remote headwaters. And they had a fisheries biologist with them who was also an angler. And at some point in the video, he kind of did a deep dive into trout behavior and analyzing the content of their stomachs. And he said that this notion that trout are very particular and very specific and tend to be key in on particular insects, this is true, but it's not really what they do for the majority of the time. So if there's an abundance of a particular fly on the water at that time, then they might, on a large dark olives, or they might even be honing in on flies at a particular stage of the life cycle. So the emergers as opposed to the duns. But for the majority of the time, trout are very generalist and they're opportunistic, and they will cruise around and eat anything that looks like food. And that really kind of stuck with me. So I've tended, over the years, I've got better and better at it, but I've tended to only carry a small number of patterns that are very generalist. They don't represent any particular insect. So I'll carry, I'm talking, Pete, the absolute classics. You're going to know the patterns before I say them, but a pheasant tail nymph, a hare's ear nymph, I tie an emerger with a CDC wing. I have a jingler in various sizes, and I have sort of comparadons, elk hair caddis. These are the sorts of patterns that I tie. But with the rusty spinner, there's a very particular phase of the blue wing olive hatch, which is, of course, after they've left the water, and then they return as mature adults to lay their eggs on the water. And the blue wing olive had been a hatch that I'd really, really struggled with for a number of years. For some reason, I was throwing patterns at fish and watching them rise and watching them take, flies off the surface of the water, not really being able to key in on it. So I had I did a little bit of research and looked at coming up with a pattern that could imitate that very specific stage of the blue wing olive hatch. So it's tied on a size 18 light wire hook. It's an orange body. It's a Coq de Leon tail, and then there's a white arrow wing and a little bit of black foam that you pull over almost as like a thorax, as like a wing cover. And I thought to myself, right, I'm only ever going to use this fly in the evenings on the River Clyde when the blue wing olives are hatching. And for some reason, it's turned out to be one of my most successful flies in a whole range of different situations. And I can't quite figure out why that's the case, because it's orange, and you don't tend to have lots of orange flies on the water. The way in which the wing sits also kind of fans out and gives almost like that the sort of double V profile to the fish when they're looking from beneath. It sits right on the top of the water, not in the surface film. So it has none of the characteristics that I would normally associate with a pattern that would be successful under different conditions. But for some reason, I don't know, the fish love it. I guess that's one of the reasons that, fly fishing is such a wonderful sport, because it can confound you. And some of the things that we do and some of the things that we observe, they don't really stand up to reason. But yeah, my rusty spinner does work even during a caddis hatch. And in the video, I actually catch fish on it in a caddis hatch. So I don't know if you have any suggestions or ideas about that, Pete. I'd love to hear them. My jingler also works for caddis as well. But yeah, I don't know.
That's the fun part about it, though, isn't it? And hypothesizing about it, and I could see how the footprint probably plays a part in it in some way, shape, or form. It represents something. And I'm always fascinated that you said the case in New Zealand about the scientist. I'm always fascinated to know when something is backed up, rather than fish took the fly because I was using £2 rather than £4 or whatever. Tippet. I don't buy into any of that sort of stuff. And when we look at clarity of water as well, I don't think it's crystal clear enough that that's going to make that much of a difference. And so I'm not 100% sure about those sorts of things. I think if it kind of looks like you say, the opportunistic thing, that fish react to stimulus. If there's not that much stimulus, then they may react in a different way to something and then perhaps eat it because it kind of looks like food, or they're interested to see what it actually is. And I'm sure there's lots of other stuff during the day that they're actually eating that actually isn't food, but they're putting it in their mouths to see. So I don't know if that's fits with, I suspect it does to a degree, with how you're feeling and thinking about it. What it does do is, consistently on here, that I'm finding the amount of people who aren't using a lot of fly patterns. And that makes me wonder that we are sort of at a point where we're driven by other factors for patterns. And, you mentioned the pheasant tail is probably one of the greatest flies of all time, isn't it? And the variations thereof in of it that can catch us a multitude of fish, will always catch us a multitude of fish, and we can make those little tweaks to them, like you say, even as simple as size, but then there's all the other permutations that go with it that make it a great pattern. And many nymphs, I guess, are probably just offshoots of a pheasant tail, aren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think the fundamentals of nymph construction probably haven't changed much since the days of Frank Sawyer. It's actually a little bit of a bugbear of mine because, from time to time I will open a fly houses catalogue and we'll look through all the new species. And I think particularly in the competition nymphing scene, there's a lot of emperor's new clothes going on where you see these cutting edge new patterns, and they've got these they've got these fancy names and whatever, and really they're just kind of recycling elements of flies that have been around and have been successful for hundreds and hundreds of years. I also think with dry fly fishing, I don't think the flies that I use probably are very, very similar to the ones that Halford would have, written about and photographed and described in his books. So yeah, it's the innovation in fly fishing probably to me isn't so much in the small details. It's more around the introduction of like trout spay casting techniques and the use of skagit heads, techniques that are used for migratory species now being used for freshwater species. And one of the things about not having too many fly patterns is I think you can probably cycle through your arsenal in terms of technique much, much quicker if you're not tying, I'll try a size 14 instead of a size 16, or I'll try a slight one with olive in it rather than one with grey in it. I'd much rather say I'm going to fish a nymph, and if the nymph doesn't work, then I'll try to fish a streamer. And if the streamer doesn't work, maybe I'll try to fish a different bit of water, or look for fish, in the riffle rather than at the bottom of the pool. And yeah, for me, that stops me getting bogged down too much in the minute detail that, yeah, I agree with you, Pete. I don't think the details are very, very important. I'm not sure if my rusty spinner would work during a canis hatch or if it would work, during the mayfly hatch on the River Test. I'm not sure if that's the case, because there are probably those circumstances where you do need, the exact imitation. But even then, a mayfly hatch, you look at the variation in the size and the coloration of the ephemera danica that might be hatching, and you probably, yeah, we're probably doing the fish a disservice if we think they only are looking at one particular colour or one particular size, or if it has two tails rather than three, then the fish are not going to look at it. And certainly I don't have any 2 pound tippet at all, but yeah, I don't buy into the fact that you have to go, super, super light. I think when that happens, generally speaking, what I do is break off on fish rather than hook more of them and land them. So yeah, I tend not to worry too much about those minute details either.
Yeah, it's nice. I'm with you. I've actually upped my tippet and I fish £4, and it's made zero impact on my life. So there we go. There may be some situations where I have to think about it a little bit more, but it won't be many of them. And I'm kind of with you when you talk about the fishing as well, that I tend to play the averages in the sense that I'm looking for where I think fish will be. And then if I'm catching them where I think they'll be, that's where I'll spend more time. It doesn't mean I'm going to run up to the next riffle or whatever it is, but I won't fish as hard and stand in one spot. So I'm always thinking, right, if it's not happening here on the section of river I fish, spend most of my time actually fishing, that I will walk down. If there's something going on, if I'm looking for there's nothing happening, I'll move again. And then I'll come back a little bit later. Right, there are fish here. I think there should be fish here. They should be rising. There's no one rising. Let's leave it. I'll come back. And then if I come back, there's nothing there, I'll fish the riffle perhaps, and then try that and see, whilst keeping an eye where I think the fish are going to rise. And for me, that kind of works. I'm not somebody who will stand in one spot and fish a pool hard. Not that I'm saying it's right or I'm saying it's wrong. It's just the sort of angler that I am, that I'll fish it relatively quickly, particularly if I'm not feeling that I'm not going to catch fish there. I may catch fish there, but where I'm thinking I'm going to catch fish is where I will probably, and if I catch fish as a result of it, that's the button I'll keep pressing. And it sounds as though you're pretty similar as well. You talk about the canis hatch as well. Canis hatch, pull a streamer through it, isn't it? That's the game, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. There's lots of hatches that will pull a streamer through, to be honest. I've taken quite a... I think I've been quite determined to learn really how to fish a streamer on my local river. The local river I fish, Pete, is the White Cart Water in Glasgow, and it's like literally I'm at the top of a hill, the river's at the bottom of a hill, and if I rolled a stone down the road, it would probably land in the river. I'm that close to it. So I spend a lot of time fishing there, and it's a quintessential urban stream. So it begins life in the hills and then very quickly makes its way into the suburbs, and works its way through the south of Glasgow, and joins the River Clyde at Glasgow Airport. And it's because it's an urban stream, it's quite a volatile stream. It's often coloured, like it often carries sediment. And although we've had a very dry year, anytime there's a little bit of rain, the rain falls straight onto the roads and straight into the the drainage channels, and then causes the river to rise. So a lot of the time when I'm fishing, I am not encountering fish feeding on insects. The rising fish are kind of a rare commodity around these parts. I have had some very good days in the end of March where I think, and again, I don't know, this is all speculation, but I think because it's an urban stream, I think it warms up a little bit quicker than the other rivers around me. So we sometimes get a nice early hatch of olives, and the caddis hatches can be absolutely fantastic. But generally, if I think about my average experience of going down to the river, I show up, maybe around lunchtime. I've got a couple of hours to fish before I have to go and get my daughter from school, and I don't really have time to wait for things to happen. So I really try to engineer a bit of entertainment, and for that, the streamer, this size 4, it's a brown woolly bugger, essentially a version of a brown woolly bugger on a jig hook with a very, very heavy bead. It's just been fantastic. It's been a revelation. I was filling in my catch return for the local angling club, and I don't think I blanked once when using that streamer, which is quite surprising. And looking at the size of fish as well, of course, it accounted for a few of the very large fish that I've caught. And around here, 3 pounds is probably about the maximum that you're going to get in this stream. My friend Liam thinks there's 4-pounders in there, and every once in a while you see a Goliath getting caught upstream, but I think they're probably stocked fish that the club further upstream put in that have grown on. But anyway, 2.5 pounds, 3 pounds is about it. But the number of fish in that sort of 3/4 of a pound to 1.5 pound range that are really, really happy to grab onto a big, big streamer has been really quite surprising. And I've been quite surprised by the consistency of the streamer bites. And it's also, it's enabled me to fish a whole range of water conditions that I probably wouldn't have been very confident fishing with a nymph or a dry fly, because the water, it's rained, the river's just come up and it's got completely dirty, but these fish are still there and they're still feeding during those water conditions, and so whether it's a canis hatch or no hatch at all, I think more often than not the streamer has been the answer for me this season.
Nice. And it is, like you say, a more, although they've been around a long time, it is a method that people are using a whole lot more than they were. For me, it's something that's in the arsenal. I didn't do any this season purely because of water levels and water temperatures and stuff like that. But like you say, I've been astounded over the years, the size of fish. And, my biggest ever Devon fish came on a streamer, which astounded me. And it was right conditions, as you say. The water was a little bit coloured. It wasn't right for salmon. It was too low for salmon. And I said to Emma, I'm going to go and pull a streamer. So I did. And I had a trout. It's one of the most beautiful trout I've ever caught, a 4.25 pound. Yet I've had fish of 6-8 inches hit the streamer just as aggressively as well. And I wonder if it is a territorial thing as well as anything else. Those takes for me tend to be pretty quick. So it's on those first, it's not always, I won't say every time, but it's not always that take will come right at the end of the swing. Is that something you've experienced? It tends to be relatively quick if you're going to get whacked?
Yes and no. It's been quite varied this year. Yeah. I mean, I've certainly had that experience of very small fish trying to have a go at the stream, and I do think there were a few fish, particularly early season, where they were kind of hooked almost on the outside of the mouth rather than the inside of the mouth, and I'm pretty sure that those are territorial reactions rather than kind of predatory reactions. And for that reason, with a large hook, you've got to go barbless. So, I mean, anyone who's listening to this and is thinking about maybe adding the streamer to their arsenal, you have to go barbless for that reason, because the takes are so aggressive. Sometimes the hook might not embed exactly where you want it to. So if you are streamer fishing, please go barbless. But yeah, my go-to tactic for the streamer, because we're fishing jig streamers with very, very large tungsten beads, I'm tending to cast upstream rather than downstream, and then let the fly drop very, very quickly, and then you're kind of pulling and almost articulating the fly with the rod rather than your left hand. Doing that kind of, it's a jerk strip action is how you'll sometimes hear it described, and that causes the fly to go up and down in the water column, because that's big heavy tungsten bead is causing it to go down, and then when you exert a little bit of pressure, it causes the fly to rise again. So I've found that fish take right at the beginning of the drift, when it's dead drifting downstream, when it's reaching depth. Sometimes the first few pulls can elicit a strike, and then sometimes again right at the very, very end, if you let the fly swing round and then kind of tweak it back towards you, sometimes a fish will come out of nowhere, out from under a rock, and kind of explode on the fly. So yeah, it's been very, very varied. I think I was talking to someone the other day, and I liken this style of streamer fishing more to jazz than rock. If you think about the swing, the traditional down and across, it's very much like cast, mend, swing, retrieve, step, cast, mend. It's very kind of it's very orderly. It's a very, very orderly approach, and everything happens in beats. Whereas if you're fishing a jig streamer, it tends to be more like, okay, cast up there, give it a few tweaks, drag it back along, cast over there, let the fly swing round. The tempos and the cadences are all over the place with it, and that's great fun as well, because it keeps you interesting. I find with down and across, which I've done quite a lot in other parts. I've done in Iceland, I've done in some of the bigger rivers across the UK. It tends to be a little bit more like my mind just wanders a little bit when I'm doing that. And I'm not a salmon fisher. You of course are a salmon fisher, Pete. But I imagine that if I were to fish for salmon, I would spend the majority of the time daydreaming, which may or may not be a good thing or a bad thing. But certainly this really intense, varying, trying to articulate the fly, trying to almost picking out specific spots on the river for your cast, and then trying to think about how that fly is going to drift round, and are you showing the fish the kind of profile of the fly, or are you trying to get the fly going towards the fish head first? And that, to me, because it's so intense and because it's so engaging, that definitely keeps me interested.
And what a lovely description that was as well, jazz. Nice. Really enjoyed that as a description. I'm getting, the lovely thing about this is that I'm getting a sense, and I know we swapped a lot of emails and talked a little bit, and I'm getting a sense of you as an angler as well, which is wonderful. And it strikes me that you think about it a lot, which I like very much. I'd like to delve into that a little bit more deeply. And you grew up on the banks of the River Devon, and then you moved back to Scotland via Berkshire. And what changes did you learn? Because obviously your brief flirtation with the streams of Berkshire, I guess, were chalk streams. From moving from Scotland to Berkshire back to Scotland, did you learn anything along the way then that has helped you with your fishing that we're talking about right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think the chalk streams sometimes get a bit of a bad rap in the angling community. I think people think that they're, very well manicured. There's always the kind of, social class element to it. People think about stocked fish. They think about rainbow trout, where there should only be, brown trout and grayling. But for me, the chalk streams were an incredible educator in terms of so many different aspects. If you're fishing I was tending to fish very kind of narrow and very shallow chalk streams. So likes of the Lambourne, the upper reaches of the River Avon, the places where I could get on for relatively cheap, Pete, if I'm going to be honest with you. And these rivers are intense. Like if you show your profile to the fish, then you will spook every single fish in that pool, and they'll probably run upstream into the next pool, and you'll spook all of those fish as well. Like your river craft has to be really, really good. And I think I learned that lesson very, very early on when I would sort of I thought I was being stealthy by by my own definition. I thought I was being very, very stealthy and would like pop my head up over some shrubbage to try and take a look and see what was happening, and just all these shapes disappearing everywhere. So, rivercraft definitely was something that I learned, and a lot of difficult lessons on the chalk streams. I think another one that you learn very quickly is about fish behaviour. And by being able to almost see into the river, you have a lens that you don't often get on the kind of peat-stained rivers that I grew up fishing on. And being able to see, how fish interact with each other sometimes is very, very interesting. So, you'll see fish stationed up behind a rock, and then you'll see a bigger fish come in and nip the tail of that fish, and then it'll disappear again. Or with grayling, the kind of pod behaviour that you see grayling adopting, where the grayling are stacked up with the biggest at the top of the pod, and then they gradually get smaller and smaller and smaller. And sometimes you plop your fly into a pod of fish, and you'll see all the bigger fish just. It's like the parting of the Red Seas, moving out of the way because they've seen that fly before, and then some daft little grayling at the end will grab it before its other daft little mate gets there. And seeing how far downstream a trout will follow a fly was something as well that just shocked me. Obviously in upstream fishing, you're taught to lead the fish by as long as you can without lining the fish. So there's that balance between casting far enough upstream but not too far that the fish can see your line. And then as your fly works back down towards the fish, you expect the fish to then sort of move forward and intercept your fly. But often what would happen on the chalk stream is the fish would sort of hover up and have a look at it, and then as your fly is moving back downstream, the fish is hovering back downstream as well and really, really eyeing it up. And I'd seen fish, adopt that behaviour and follow a fly for meters, like meters and meters and meters before deciding either to grab it or sort of turning away at the end. And yeah, those lessons, I think you can sort of learn about them in theory, and you could probably read about those things in a book, but to be there and to be present in this remarkable landscape with this gin clear water and these really, really interesting fish, and see how they behave and see the way in which they behave in relation to you as well, was something that you're right, I'm a very kind of thinkative angler, and I definitely spent a lot of time driving back and forth to over towards Bristol and back to Reading through Berkshire, a lot of time thinking, I really, really had a hard day today. What was it? What was happening? And I think those lessons have probably followed me up to Scotland as well, because I'm certainly a better angler now than I was when I left Scotland, if that makes sense.
Yeah, very good. And that segues beautifully, because you were talking about the fish following a fly and many of the other things that I've talked about on here before as well, the grayling, how they just move to the side, really, don't they? And then move back into line, which to me says change your fly again until you find the right one. But it segues beautifully into your Dreamstream film, that there is a shot where, and I love to see this, where there's a small fish rises just opposite you. And it's fascinating, isn't it, when you're standing watching a fish further upstream and you've not cast for a little while, or you've not done anything for a little bit, and then a fish will rise opposite you, and then very often you flip and it's gone because the movement of the rod has, or whatever it is, that movement has made it go. But you went and hooked that fish as well, didn't you? It rose right opposite, and I thought, is he going to go for it? Is he going to go for it? And you did, and the fish took as well, which must have been a pretty cool moment, that as well, particularly as you had the video on it.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's important to say as well, there's a lot of editing goes into these videos. So for every cool moment of angling prowess, there's a lot of duff moments where I end up hooking the bank behind me, or hooking a tree, or hooking myself, or doing anything but that. Yeah, that fish took me by surprise, because I'd been standing in that spot for quite a while, and fishing into the kind of the prime location of the pool, which is where the riffle came in, and there was a much deeper bit of water. And then suddenly there was this, and I'm the water was quite clear, so I'm very surprised. I don't know if it maybe fell backwards from being in the pool, following an insect, and then just kind of hung out there for a little bit. But yeah, it's not always the case that when there's a difficult trout that I have a go at it and it actually works out. So yeah, it was nice to see that caught on camera. People think I'm a much better angler than I am because of how much editing goes into these videos. So sometimes I meet up with people and they're surprised at how much time I spend untangling my leader or fishing my flies out of the trees. But that's an interesting point as well about social media and about YouTube. And sometimes I wonder, for people who are getting into angling, if there's a kind of distorted reality that, or a very rose tinted picture of the sport that they get painted, and whether or not their expectations are a little bit high when they first go out onto the river, and maybe they've just bought their first fly rod and they've gone out with a mate, and they're expecting it to be much easier than it is, because all they're seeing is this examples of success repeated again and again and again and again. So as well as being a cool moment for that one, it did make me think, and it does make me think quite a lot about how sort of authentic we are as creators in this space, and how much of a real insight into the pain and the suffering and the reality and the difficulty and the challenge of fishing that we give people in things like videos and social media posts and whatever it happens to be.
That's a very interesting point. I know we touched on this, and I'm having an interesting conversation on the Fly Culture Facebook page about it at the moment, and about the role of influencers, and not just in fishing. But it just dawned on me. We'll talk about what you said about the perception, because I think you're exactly right, that it seems to be that I think people worry that if there isn't a picture of a fish or whatever it is, that people aren't going to like the post, and then, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's the stuff that isn't the grip and grin that I'm really fascinated about. And, I try and be honest about if getting stuck in a tree or whatever it is, and don't worry about it. And I thought about it yesterday, and I wrote a long reply to somebody, because we were talking about the role of influencers. And I said the difference in fishing is that we don't have elite performers per se. And what I mean by that is, if we look at cycling, if we look at tennis, if we look at football, we've got people at the top of their game who are professionals at it, that are, as a result of that, they may be celebrities. So it's easy for companies to approach them and, talk to them about sponsorship and everything else. Whereas we don't actually have that in fishing per se. And you touched on competition fishing, and whether I agree with it or not agree with it doesn't matter, but it's not working in quite the same way. Whereas before the advent of social media, we had books and magazine articles that people were writing. I think there's probably only 3 or 4 people I would call angling celebrities that I look up to. The rest are people who have a high profile. In fishing, there is a difference. And like you say, there is a pressure probably for content creators to feel that they need to be posting this sort of stuff. Whereas it doesn't matter, does it? And like you say, I put a picture of a bacon sandwich or whatever. I don't really care that much. I like it as a creative output. And I suspect this is why we got talking, because I suspect you feel similar about it as well, don't you? That it's a way, yet you do get sucked into that world of having to put something out that you think people will like. Is that a fair comment, do you think?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because to be a creator, whether it's photography, or whether it's writing articles, or whether it's producing films of whatever quality, there's always an audience in mind. And I do follow quite a lot of creators on YouTube to try and learn more about the creative process. And there's an interesting kind of debate often comes up there between the value of creating something for yourself as opposed to the value of creating for an audience. And I think where in fly fishing that becomes particularly challenging, or it can be particularly thorny, is I suspect there are creators on platforms like YouTube who are basing their fishing around a perception of what the audience wants from them rather than what they would like to do themselves. And so you do see, like, I don't want to focus attention on any one creator, because I don't think that would be particularly fair, but you do see creators from time to time who recycle the same kind of gimmicky approach. So it'll be to go and buy the cheapest fly rod and try and catch a fish on it, or to make a fly rod and try and catch a fish on it. And there's nothing wrong with that. And sometimes these videos are quite interesting. But I wonder if one would do that were the camera not pointing at you. And if the answer to that question is no, then it's something very interesting to kind of consider and reflect on. Like, is your experience being shaped by your perception of the audience, or are you being authentic and actually doing what you really, really want to do? And I think about my creative journey. I mean, I started on YouTube by accident when we moved to Glasgow, and my wife, for a birthday present, bought me a GoPro. And the idea was that my wife, her family live in Greece, and so we go on holiday to Greece fairly regularly. And the idea was that we would do some diving and some snorkeling with this GoPro and take amazing pictures of, like, small fish and coral reefs and whatever. But my birthday's in February, and we weren't going on holiday for a little while. So I took it down to the White Cart Water, one of the first times that I was fishing there. And I didn't really know. I mean, I bought a permit for the angling club, but I didn't have any confidence in my ability to actually locate a trout in the city. Like, I just thought, this is bonkers. I'll do this once or twice and it won't go very well, and I won't do it again, and it'll be, end of experiment. But I caught a really, really nice trout with the GoPro on, and I wanted to show it to my dad, to be honest. I wanted to share this video with my dad. My dad lives in Stirling, so rather than taking the GoPro to him, I put it on YouTube. He shared it on a Facebook page, it got shared on another Facebook page, and suddenly, there were like thousands of views within a few days. And then I didn't think anything of it, but then the comments started appearing. You should do more. This was really, really good. You should do more. And I thought, well, maybe I will do a little bit more. And it took me about a year to record my second video and upload that to YouTube after the first one. I had no intention whatsoever of doing that, of starting a channel. Like, I just couldn't see the value in it at all. But then the kind of positive reactions from people, and the nicest comments, particularly in the beginning, were people saying, oh, this was really great. I haven't been fly fishing for ages, but after seeing this, I might actually go and get my fly rod out and do a little bit of fishing. Or there were a couple of really nice comments early on from people who had they were elderly now, and due to the rigors of age, weren't able to fish at all, and they commented that they were kind of living vicariously through these videos. So that was fantastic. And then I had a period of time thinking, well, maybe actually having a channel would be something that was quite cool. And yeah, I definitely found that there were tendencies within me that wanted to catch big fish to show to people, because I thought they would find it interesting, or go to really, really cool locations and do things that were a little bit wacky. And the whole urban fishing thing, which I was doing anyway, seemed to be quite interesting and novel for people. So that naturally became something to base the videos around. And then when COVID happened, that was a whole other conversation about the impact of COVID on a whole range of processes, one of which was angling and our ability to get to the water. So I made a few videos where I was reflecting on COVID. But now I've come to the realization that, I'm at my happiest as a creator when I'm doing things that I enjoy. And where the audience comes in is that other people respond not to your, pining and pandering to them and trying to gain their attention, but they respond to your authenticity. Like, I've definitely reached that conclusion. And so as a creator moving forward and thinking about what to do with the channel, I'm doing much, much less on the channel. I'm trying to focus on doing things that I'm really passionate about, and things that that tell people a bit more about me and about what I'm interested in, and the reflections and the discussions around fishing, not just what tackle I'm using or why I'm using this fly, but actually, what's the emotion, like what's the decision making, why have I gone to this place rather than that place? And I think that, as a creator, that's probably a way to just navigate some of these challenges and some of the pressure that we bring on ourselves because we exist in this social media world, I think.
Yeah, nicely put. And I can see, having sat and watched all of your videos now, I can see that change. It's quite apparent and it's quite clear. And the dream stream for me, as I said in the introduction, the introduction that you talk about is absolutely beautiful. And the way you narrate it speaks volumes as well. And it is about the journey. Apologies about the J word, but it is literally the journey from where you are to where you're going to. And your arrival there, the river, everything about it, to me, worked perfectly well from that point of view. And I really, really enjoyed it from that point of view. I know we were talking off mic beforehand, but to give listeners an idea, and I hope you'll, if you haven't, because many people have seen them already, but if you haven't already, and if you're of a certain vintage, it reminds me of a wonderful TV program called A River Somewhere, which came out of the Australia/New Zealand. And to me, I watched Dreamstream again yesterday, and it reminded me of it greatly. And I know you've not seen it, but I can assure you I mean that as a compliment, because it's about so much more. In this particular program, they take it a little bit further, and they take fish and they cook it and they celebrate it and they eat it as well. But the whole feel of it is about more than, like you say, the end product. And that's why it resonated so loudly to me. Did you detect that as you upload each one? Do you think, have you seen that sort of path that you've actually navigated yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm not a filmmaker. I spent some years of my life in my late 20s and early 30s working as a freelance photographer. So the kind of sensibilities around imagery and composition, they do come quite naturally to me. But I'm not a filmmaker at all. So I've been kind of learning on the job with YouTube, and it can be quite vulnerable because you're posting something knowing that the next video that you post is going to be way much better. But I've decided to leave all of the older videos on YouTube because I think I do get quite frequently people asking questions about how they should get started and what technology to use, and I often say look back at those early videos because they were rubbish and I was filming them on my phone and a GoPro. But I had to go through that creative process in order to, learn. And again, this is something about the society in which we live, where I think people expect instant gratification and instant perfection whenever they try something new. So yeah, I've deliberately left those videos there to show people the the journey, to use that J word again. And with this one, with Dreamstream, I think it was the best video that I could have uploaded at the time because it's where I am in my kind of evolution as a creator. And I think that the evolution is both my ability to use the equipment, upgrading the equipment, so I now have a nicer camera than I started off with, but I think through making the first videos I've also found, and again this sounds so cheesy, people, I hope you're not cringing listening to this, but I think I've found my voice as a creator as well, and I've really gained an understanding of what's interesting to me. And what is interesting to me is, just as you articulated, Pete, it's like 10% the fishing and 90% everything else that's happening and the kind of the context in which the fishing takes place. Interestingly, you can't subtract the 10% and just focus on the 90%. Otherwise, it would just be like casual encounters with nature or something, like without the fishing, it doesn't hang together. And I do like going walking in the wilderness and I like climbing hills, but there's nothing that causes me to connect with nature like fishing. That there's just something about it. There's something about the interplay of the different elements and about you as a person being in that space and what you're trying to do. And having understood that as a person and as an angler as well on this journey, I hope that, or my my goal and my desire is very much to try and reflect that more and more in the videos. So the next video that comes along will be better than, hopefully, will be better than the dream stream. But the journey, it's important. I think it's important for me to have a record of that journey as well, as much for myself as for others who are thinking about starting out and who have to go through a similar process as well.
Nice. And something you touched on there, you said, about you're fortunate that you have an eye. And one of the things I was going to ask you, because there's a beautiful shot of the video you did in Iceland where you're walking past a barn or whatever, and it's just beautifully framed, beautifully shot. And you said you're fortunate that you have an eye for it. Do you think these sorts of skills, because, you're talking very much in mind with people who have contacted you doing something similar or perhaps trying to create content of their own, do you think these are skills that you just have, they're natural, or do you think they can be taught? Do you learn that over time? Is there something too deep inside that is difficult for other people to see? Because I can tell a good picture, and if I'm choosing a cover, which I choose all the covers for the magazine, I think I can choose one. Could I take one? I'm not 100% sure. So do you think that is something that can be taught and that you learn, or do you think there's something a bit deeper inside?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a way of seeing, and I think that there's something that interesting that happens. There's when you go to create something, we'll take the example of photography, but if you go to create an image, then there's, you have yourself and you have the camera, and then you have the scene in front of you, and to take a really, really good image, you do have to understand some of the mechanics of image composition, so that there has to. It doesn't have to be, but there often is, a foreground element and a middle ground and a background, and there's a dynamic interplay between the elements and the fore and the middle and the background, that leads the eye of the viewer through the scene, and there have to be points of interest, and there are things about light and contrast where the eye is drawn to the place with the greatest contrast in an image. So if that's way off to the side, then your eye will never actually make its way through the scene. So there are all of these technical aspects, and I think that there's a kind of pre-visualization that happens, first of all, in the mind of the photographer, and then there's just a way of arranging the camera and choosing the focal length, and sometimes it's just about sitting and waiting for the light to happen, and for the light to be the thing that elevates the scene. So these things can be taught, but I honestly think that you can learn all of these lessons, and if you never put them into practice, then they don't lead to a transformation in you as a creator, as a photographer, as a filmmaker. So I do think that there's a dynamic interplay between what you know and then practice. And as you practice, it changes what you know, and it inspires you to go and find out new things about that creative process. And then with those new things, your ability to put them into practice increases. I think that for me that there are very few landscape photographers who I think are really, really up there. But I think, you've got Ansel Adams and you've got the Scottish photographer Colin Pryor, and you don't have a lot in between, which is interesting because landscape photography is such a popular pastime for people, particularly in this country. So then, probably to become a good photographer, you can learn the rules of composition, you can put them into practice. But then again, I do think with mastery, it's probably there's something of the divine in there. There's a spark that probably certain people have, and or maybe we all have, but certain people, because of their way of seeing the world, they activate that spark. I'm not sure, but yeah. Definitely, there's a balance between these two things, learning and practice, and that's about catching trout as well. I think that applies equally to fishing. You can learn all the rules about how to construct a leader and what flies to use when, but unless you actually go out there and spend time on the water, this is just going to be theoretical, and you're not actually going to learn how to put that into practice and how to choose the right strategy for the right situation and so on.
I like that. That's the best classroom, isn't it? The water is the best
Absolutely.
place to learn, and nice to get an insight as well. So I don't want you to give too much away, but have you got sort of the next film in your mind that you want to do and how you want to do it? Have you started planning that? Have you sat down with a map looking at blue lines and things, or are you getting everything in your mind? Is it, because I get the sense it's not a rushed, I've got to bring something out process for you, which I like very much as well. So do you sort of sit on ideas for a little bit before you sort of start to put them into motion?
I do, yeah, and that's how I plan my fishing as well. I think, yeah, the kind of the trips to unexplored places, and poring over blue lines on a map, and my Google Earth has more pins in it than a pin cushion. There's so many parts of the north of Scotland that I've flagged and worked out how long it'll take me to get there and where I would park the car, and so on and so forth. But in terms of my next film, I don't have a particular plan in mind. I think I've probably got to the stage where I think I've reached about the limit of what I can do just filming myself walking about in beautiful places and catching trout. So I think what I'd like to do is probably collaborate more with other creative people, and my story, the story that I tell about myself in Dreamstream, probably isn't going to change in the next year or the next 10 years. So I probably kind of told that story. So it would be interesting really to think about finding other people to collaborate with and maybe learning to tell their stories a little bit. Certainly some of the creatives that I look up to in this space, probably people that Pete, from your from your interactions with the fishing community, but Patrick Tillard, Damon Valentine, Stefan from the Fly Fishing Nation. I watch the way in which they're able to communicate stories which have both their own personality and the personalities of others, and I think that's probably, from my own filmmaking, that's probably where the next evolution will lie. So it's probably about finding someone to help me bring what I do to the next level. Is probably where the next steps will be.
Fantastic. That sounds really interesting. And so for people, where can you just give us a synopsis of Dreamstream? Because for our listeners, I think if you haven't seen it, I really think you'll enjoy it, particularly if you like fly culture as well. Can you give us a brief synopsis of it and tell listeners where they can find it as well, please, Sean?
Sure, yeah. So, to answer that question first, I'm on YouTube as Southside Fly Fishing. You can also find, I'll link everything through my Instagram, but I'm on Instagram as Sean_Afnan, AFNAN. That's my mother's maiden name for anyone who's interested. And the synopsis of Dreamstream is, it's really about me exploring the love of wild trout and wild places through a trip that I take to the north of Scotland. And I also introduce people to some of the fishing that I do locally, and try to share a little bit of my background in terms of how I came to enjoy fly fishing, and how I came to enjoy fly fishing in wild places in particular. We take you through a little bit of an introduction to my home stream, the White Cart, so we do a little bit of fishing there. And then the kind of narrative is really about comparing these two realities. So having a trout stream on my doorstep, even though it's an urban stream, and even though there's more kind of concrete and iron than anything else in that stream, then I think at one point I hook a rusty can of Stella Artois. So that's the reality of fishing in Glasgow, but it's wonderful, and honestly, to have that on my doorstep is wonderful. But there is something transcendent about leaving your everyday reality and taking a trip to somewhere else where you just have nature. And I think the northwest of Scotland is one of those places where, although man's influence is apparent, there's a reason why there are no trees, there's a reason why there are loads of deer, and there are fences everywhere. The kind of processes of geomorphic evolution that you're able to observe in places like the far northwest of Scotland do take you out of yourself and make you feel very, very small, and help you to think about your place in the kind of the ecosystem and the evolution of the planet. So although I'm, chasing fish in these wild places, I'm also chasing a deeper connection with the landscape, and hopefully that comes through a little bit in some of the narration in particular. But I try to film as much of the mountains and the trees and the foliage, as well as me catching fish. And spoiler alert for people who like beautiful wild trout, and quite a lot of them. That day at the Dreamstream, I did really, really well on. Interestingly, Pete, I caught most of the fish on a single wet fly, fished down and across. So all that stuff that we were talking about earlier about the technicalities of fly fishing, hard to reach places tend to have easy to catch trout, and it's not always the case, but certainly in the Dreamstream, that's that's where we got to. And there's one particular, it's the coolest thing I've ever done as a creator, where I managed to film a take of a decent trout. I think it was probably about 16 or 17 inches, taking a parachute Adams from the surface. And so for that scene alone, if you haven't seen Dreamstream already, then I do encourage you to check it out. And, let me know what you think of it, because I've learned so much about this creative process by getting feedback from other people. So, if you haven't seen it already, do check it out. Let me know what you think. And we'll grow together as a community as we learn to share one another's stories, I think.
Fantastic. And I'll have a link in the show notes as well if people just want to click that. And I'd also like to welcome you to the Fly Culture family as a contributor as well. You sent me a piece that will come out in the spring edition. So welcome along, and thank you for that as well. I really enjoyed reading that, and I've loaded it up already. So you'll be in Fly Culture as well come springtime.
Thank you. And that's such a privilege, Pete. I mean, I think fly culture is really, really cool. I think the way in which you've managed to, carve out a niche for yourself in the digital world, where you have both the digital but also the kind of analog elements. I think the quality of stories that you're able to tell, the range of contributors that you have, the tactility of the magazine, and just when it comes through the door, how it feels and how it smells. All of these things are just wonderful, and they resonate so much with me as a person as well as an angler. And so to be able to become part of that family is a real privilege, and I do thank you greatly for taking the time to watch the video, to read what I sent you, and I'm just delighted to know that that's going to be coming up in a future edition of the magazine.
It certainly will. Do you know, we've talked well over an hour now, and I feel like I've only scratched the surface, but what it's done is given us and given the listeners a chance to learn a little bit about you, which is always important to me. I always want to learn about the person and as them as an angler. And, having seen the film, as I said, that I knew the sort of angler that you actually were. And so I'd love to say a huge thank you for taking the time to talk with me today, Sean. I've really, really enjoyed having you as a guest on the Fly Culture podcast.
Thanks, Pete. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Sean. Well, everyone, this has been the Fly Culture podcast. Thank you so much for listening. As ever, these are always free to download, so you can enjoy these at any stage that you would like to. And if you are enjoying them, please consider subscribing. I don't want any money out of them or anything along those sorts of lines. I'm told that it just allows other people to find us if you do that as well. And if you leave a comment or something like that, I'm told that helps as well. So this has been another edition of the Fly Culture podcast. There'll be plenty more very, very soon.
The Fly Culture podcast is brought to you in association with Fly Culture, a quarterly print magazine. For more information, please visit flyculturemag.com. You can also find Fly Culture on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter.